Welcome to the program on the day Australia's engrossing political standoff finally ended, to Julia Gillard's immense relief and Tony Abbott's deep disappointment. And in keeping with the pattern of the past 2.5 weeks, the High Wire Act of the three rural independents continued to play out over much of the day. Bob Katter first in the early afternoon, committing to the coalition, and then in a tantalisingly slow revelation at their press conference, Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott gave Labor just enough numbers to claim government with the smallest possible majority. And if Labor does manage to govern for 3 years with 6 crossbench MPs in effect, and next year's new Senate where the Greens have the balance of power, it will be the trickiest political tightrope walk in our collective lifetimes. In a moment, I'll be talking with Julia Gillard, Tony Windsor and Bob Katter. But first, here's political editor Heather Hewitt.
Parliament House was on edge from daybreak, as all of its occupants wondered who would form a minority government by the end of the day.
The three of us want it to happen today.
People will scream and kick and be disappointed. We're getting there. This is crazy.
Rob, can you just confirm that three will be moving together?
Three always move together.
No, they weren't moving together. At lunchtime, Bob Katter left talks with his fellow independents after just half an hour to make this solo announcement.
I will be backing the coalition, yes. Now, no, do not infer from that, please, that my colleagues, they are still in discussion and what outcome they come to. But I said, that's my decision.
It was a decision based on his 20-point list of demands to both sides and what he said was Labor's refusal to support 8 of them, including a deal on ethanol and giving jobs to Indigenous Australians on their own housing projects.
I think they don't see it the way that I see it, in the sense that there's 20 points there. Their position is more complex.
It would be another 2 hours before we learned what his colleagues had decided. At a packed news conference, they arrived separately. Rob Oakeshott was first and didn't seem to know what to do.
Tony hasn't been seen, or...? OK.
A few minutes later, Tony Windsor emerged to state the obvious.
This probably will be a fairly historic day. Well, I guess what you've really been wanting to know is who will form the government.
It began to dawn on those present that the two would be making separate announcements.
I intend, with my vote, for what it's worth, to support the Labor Party. The issues that I thought were critical to this, and possibly the most critical, was broadband.
Rob Oakeshott's turn now, and he was in no hurry to spell out his position. Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott hadn't been informed either and were glued to their TV screens.
One of my favourite movies when I was a kid was the Highlander movie and the famous line, and then there was one.
Yes, indeed, and one who seemed to be delaying stating who he was going to back.
They would both be good Prime Ministers. There is no question about that. And if anything, that has made this decision all the more difficult for me.
After another excruciating 15 minutes where he outlined all he'd agonised over for more than 2 weeks, finally came this.
I'm confirming for the Governor-General of Australia that today I'll do what I have always done, ironically, and give confidence and supply to government. And in effect, that means confidence and supply in Julia Gillard, unless, and I emphasise unless, exceptional circumstances determine otherwise.
Stability of government appeared to be central to their decisions, which were not made lightly. They wanted to avoid Australians going back to the ballot box, and in the course of negotiations felt they'd moved country Australia into the limelight. As they thanked both leaders for their cooperation, all in the room were conscious there was only one winner, and she now clings to government by the skin of her teeth.
Labor is prepared to deliver stable, effective and secure government for the next 3 years. To quote Rob Oakeshott, sunshine is the best disinfectant. And we've agreed to far-reaching reforms that make me as Prime Minister and our government and how it functions more accountable to the Australian people. So let's draw back the curtains and let the sunshine in.
Of course, it's not as simple as that, and everyone involved knows it. This is a tricky exercise the country hasn't experienced for 70 years. It also comes at a price. Billions of dollars to be poured into regional Australia, and the promise of an executive position related to regional reforms for Rob Oakeshott if he wants it.
I've certainly spoken to Mr Oakeshott as to whether he would be interested in serving in an executive capacity.
I've got to go home and talk to the family I haven't seen for 8 weeks.
For Tony Abbott, there was obvious disappointment. Though senior Liberals had been bracing for today's result right to the last, they still held out some hope.
The longest election is finally over. The coalition won more votes and more seats than our opponents. But sadly, we did not get the opportunity to form a government.
What's open to question now is how the opposition plays the game from here on in, as the new minority government moves into untested territory.
How quickly we go back to an election depends entirely on the performance of this government.
No matter how politics unfolds in the months ahead, and that's anyone's guess, Australia does at least now know what its government is after days of uncertainty. Late today, Julia Gillard presented her credentials to form government to the Governor-General, who'd rushed back from Melbourne to meet her. But there's still no date set for Julia Gillard and her new ministry to be sworn in.
Political editor Heather Ewart.